So I think we all can agree that we are experiencing difficult times. All the assumptions on which we had based, in which governments, business people, academics had based their plans are suddenly out of the window. So we had assumed that our firms, endowed with superior technological skills, would actually dominate the world stage and would prevent the competition from emerging market firms. We also had assumed that the regime under which the past has developed, which can be called the liberal order, we had assumed that the globalization that it had started and continued and which had benefited certainly a part of the population, that globalization would continue because it is bringing benefits to a large number of people. We also had argued that countries led by rational decision makers, whether authoritarian or democratic, would continue to play by the rules that have been set up, the liberal rules that have been set up by the United States and European countries and also Japan. But in the last 5-6 years, all these assumptions seem to have been shattered. So we have seen that our multinational firms are now subject to very fierce competition by very capable emerging market firms and have caught up with our technology much faster than we thought, and in some cases even are higher, have achieved even higher technological advances, for example, in the fintech sector. We also have seen a country like the UK, which had prospered tremendously by joining the most efficient common market in the world, and which had done that in terms that were tremendously advantageous to it, having all kind of opt-outs and having basically their contribution reduced by many schemes. This country actually decided to withdraw from the Union with substantial cost, not only on itself, but also on others. And of course, the UK is not the only case. There is also the very recent case of Russia, which seems to be giving up its very successful export market to the West in exchange for the pursuit of chimerical and probably undoable, unfeasible goals. So why is it that we are in a situation where we are? So I think that we basically have proceeded on the basis of 4 assumptions. The first one is that superior technology is a sufficient condition for success in an international marketplace. The second one is that shareholder value maximization is in fact the universal goal of managers throughout the world. The third one is that the governments of the world top emerging market firms had actually bought into the liberal economic order which has been set up by the United States and Europe and other large, and Japan and other dominant economic powers. And then the fourth assumption on which we all had based our plans is that economic value or economic gains would actually trump non-rational appeals, for example, to nationalism or to xenophobia. All of those assumptions, I think, are wrong, and I'm just basically going to go and explain shortly why they are wrong. The first one is the assumption that superior technology is in fact a sufficient condition for economic success. The problem is that whenever you go to a foreign market to produce there, you not only need intangibles such as good reputation, good trade names, and superior technology, but you need complementary assets. So if you want, for example, to manufacture in China, having a superior technology is not sufficient. You also need, for example, access to raw materials, access to government permits. You must be allowed to produce there. You must have access to labor to employ in your manufacturing plant. And also, especially, you need access to customers. Now, the problem is that those complementary assets in emerging markets are held by local firms. And sometimes those local firms have tremendous monopoly power because the market in which they sell those services is inefficient. If the market for all of those complementary assets is efficient, then the multinational can enter that with a wholly owned subsidiary, and basically the problem is solved. But in many cases, those complementary assets are in fact sold in highly imperfect market. One reason, for example, is that the government monopolizes access to customers. So if you're selling, for example, fast train technology or fast train equipment to China, you have to go through the Chinese government, which governs access to the customer. So in that case, the task of the multinational is to obtain access to complementary assets. The task of local competitors, such as Chinese firms, is to get access to technology. The question to ask is, which of those two assets is easier to obtain? And the answer is very clear. Technology, brand names, can be accessed in highly competitive Western markets. For example, technology sometimes is embedded into firms. In the West, the market for firms is very efficient. What's called the market for corporate control is very efficient. Not only is there transparency about the value of the targets, but you also can borrow money from Western venture capital firms, and you can ask Western advisors to actually help you in a process. Think about, on the other hand, how difficult it is for Western firms to obtain, for example, access to consumers or access to crucial raw materials. In that case, quite often you cannot acquire local firms. When you can acquire, because of government restrictions, when you can acquire local firms, the value of the firm is quite opaque, and very often those firms actually are highly diversified. So the market for acquisition is highly imperfect. Another way to obtain technology, of course, is through the market for people. And there is a very interesting case study of Huawei basically obtained technology. They basically went to all the firms that were closing down, for example, Nokia in Sweden, and they set up a subsidiary across the road where they hire all those people that suddenly were deprived of a job. So as a result, non-Western firms, emerging market firms, have managed to catch up and sometimes even surpass multinational firms, while many large multinational firms have actually experienced very significant restrictions in entering foreign markets. The second assumption that we worked on, and which turned out not to be true, is the idea that shareholder value maximization is a universal goal followed by most top managers. This neglects the fact that in many countries, even developed countries, there is a very tight interaction between government service and the post of manager in large firms. In France and Japan, for example, there's a continuous turnover between large bureaucracies, large administration, and large local firms, large French firms or Japanese firms. As you probably know, in all Chinese firm, or almost all Chinese firm, there is a cell of the Communist Party. That cell of the Communist Party makes sure that the action of the subsidiary, and this includes, by the way, foreign-owned subsidiaries, that the action of the subsidiary is in fact aligned with the goals of the Communist Party. So the separation in China between public firms and private firms is in fact, just to a large extent, notional, but not real. An interesting example of this fallacy is the idea that was very widespread in the UK, that all that the UK had to do is to basically talk to German top managers, and that the pressure of German top managers seeking to safeguard the market for their cars in the UK would in fact put pressure on Angela Merkel, and that she would basically accede to US demands. In fact, Angela Merkel met with the top managers of German firms, and they all fell in line that the safeguard of the common market was much more important than a temporary setback of losing your sales to Germany. And I could, of course, use many other examples. The third assumption, I think, that was made, that we made in the West, is that the use by countries such as China or Brazil or many other emerging markets, the participation of those countries in the liberal economic order meant an adhesion to the values of the liberal economic order. In fact, if you looked at the case of China, the participation in the liberal economic order, the world market, the globalization, was in fact purely instrumental. Same can be said to some extent to Brazil. In other words, China used the liberal economic order in order to develop their exports, their economic wealth, and their technological capabilities, while standing ready at any point to abandon this liberal economic order when it had reached a sufficient level of economic development. And we know that from the policy of what's called dual circulation, which they have adopted, by which they are developing domestic supply to match domestic demand in order to isolate themselves from the world economy should the need arise to do so. So at the same time that China has been playing in the liberal economic order, it has not adopted the value of the liberal economic order, which is, for example, freedom of the press, freedom of individual opinion, and political, the basically political democracy, which is plurality in political parties. This basically has, I think, some very important implications. And the implication is that we cannot assume that continuous engagement with those countries actually will assure a future of peaceful coexistence and cooperation with those countries. The third, I think, erroneous assumption that we made is that economic gains would actually trump appeals to ideology, appeals to xenophobia, appeal to nationalism. In fact, there have been two very recent examples of exactly the contrary. One of them is Brexit, where appeals to xenophobia, appeals to jingoism have in fact very easily trumped consideration of economic gain. And so, in spite of a very clear economic balance sheet to the favor of remaining in the European Union, the British population, in fact, has chosen a course of action which will cost them 4% of GDP per year in a foreseeable future, and which is causing losses not only to the UK, but also to the EU and to the rest of the world. And of course, we've seen exactly the same thing happen in the case of Russia, where Putin is basically putting in jeopardy the main source of foreign exchange and the main type of exports in exchange in a pursuit of what turned out to be illusory political gains. So now is the time. So what do we do? Well, we obviously should have seen it coming. We did not. We did not see it coming, I think, is because we are prisoner of a very Anglo-Saxon way of thinking, which is basically carried by academia, by academics, which is carried by consulting firms, which is carried by the power of the United States and other Anglo-Saxon countries. We did not see it coming. We should have seen it coming. And I think now is the time to deconstruct all our assumptions and to go back to more realistic ones.